Can you imagine stepping into a cage where there are no weight classes, no judges, no time limits, just two fighters, bare-knuckled, throwing down with no one to stop the carnage? Sounds like something out of an underground fight club, right? Well, that's exactly how the UFC started.
Well, you know, I had no business being in a fight promotion business at all.
No rules, no structure, and no guarantees that fighters would walk out unscathed. It was chaos, it was brutal, and honestly, we're lucky no one lost their life in those early days.
Promoters say the only way it ends is if a doctor intervenes, the fighter gives up, passes out, or dies on the mat.
But here's the shocking part. How UFC transformed into one of the biggest, most respected sports in the world. Because the UFC learned to adapt. It introduced rules, safety measures, and a system that didn't just protect fighters but also made the sport more entertaining. And trust me, the journey from street fight savagery to mainstream dominance wasn't smooth. So, how did the UFC evolve from a lawless fight into the billion-dollar juggernaut we know today?
I remember when Campbell did an interview with the New York Times, he quoted the fighter's contract that I had written. You know, that a fight could end. One of the ways it could terminate was in death. And, the press picked up on things like that and ran with it enormously.
Let's take a deep dive into the rules that shaped the sport rules that were born from blood, controversy, and near disasters. Some of these changes saved fighters' careers, others saved lives. And one rule? Well, it might have just saved a sumo wrestler from being launched into the front row. Let's rewind to 1993. The first ever UFC event had only 3 ways to end a fight: knockout, submission, or if a fighter's corner threw in the towel. The referee? He was just there for decoration. He couldn't stop a fight no matter how much damage a fighter took. And if you think that's bad, wait until you hear about the fight that changed everything. In UFC 2, Pat Smith rained down a series of elbows on Scott Morris, knocking him out cold. But with no authority to intervene, referee Big John McCarthy was left screaming at Morris's corner to stop the fight. It was a moment that made McCarthy snap. After the event, he gave the UFC an ultimatum: give referees the power to stop fights, or he was out. The UFC listened. By UFC 3, referees finally had the power to step in and protect fighters from unnecessary damage. A small change? Maybe. But without it, we might not even have a UFC today. It all started with some of the most controversial moments in MMA history, moments that forced the sport to evolve. Take Royce Gracie's infamous 1994 fight against Kimo Leopoldo. Gracie, known for his jiu-jitsu mastery, was in serious trouble on his back. But instead of relying solely on technique, he grabbed a handful of Leopoldo's hair to control him, something that was completely legal at the time. That sneaky move helped Gracie survive and eventually win the fight. It wasn't long before the UFC banned hair pulling, marking one of the first major rule changes in the sport's history. But that was just the beginning. No time limits, no rounds, just 2 fighters going at it until someone was finished. It sounded good on paper until UFC 5 happened. Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock, a rematch everyone was hyped for. But instead of an all-out war, fans got a snooze fest.
You hear some boos because people want to see punches. In a street fight,
Gracie and Shamrock spent 36 agonizing minutes locked in the same position, neither making a move, both waiting for the other to slip. With no time limit and no way to force action, the fight dragged on until it ended in a dull, frustrating draw. The backlash was immediate. Fans were bored, the UFC was embarrassed, and something had to change. So they introduced time limits, forcing fighters to push the pace and avoid another 36-minute disaster. Some fighters like Royce Gracie hated the change and even left the promotion. But for the UFC, it was a make-or-break moment. You think early UFC fights were wild? Nothing compares to what happened in 1996. Tank Abbott, a powerhouse known for his raw aggression, found himself inside the cage with Cal Worsham. At one point, Abbott did something so outrageous it could have ended the UFC right then and there. He tried to throw Worsham over the cage and into the crowd. Imagine the chaos if he had succeeded. The lawsuits, the injuries, the public outrage. Luckily, Worsham barely avoided being launched like a human missile, thanks to the cage padding. But that near disaster forced the UFC to implement a new rule. Any attempt to throw an opponent out of the cage? Instant disqualification. For years, UFC fighters fought bare-knuckle, making fights look more like street brawls than professional matchups. But that changed in 1997, when the UFC made gloves mandatory. The move not only protected fighters' hands, but also made the sport appear more legitimate. That same year, weight classes were introduced. Before that, a 170-pound striker could be pitted against a 250-pound wrestler. It was as crazy as it sounds. But UFC 12 finally split fighters into divisions, making matchups more competitive and the sport more fair. Believe it or not, groin shots, headbutts, and even fish hooking. Yes, sticking fingers in an opponent's mouth and yanking were all legal in the early UFC days. One of the most infamous moments? UFC 4. Keith Hackney versus Joe Son. Son had Hackney in a guillotine choke, and how did Hackney escape? By repeatedly punching Son in the groin. It was legal. It was brutal. And after that, the UFC knew they had to draw a line. Strikes to the back of the head were also allowed, until UFC 4, when Dan Severn landed a series of them on Royce Gracie. The risk of serious spinal injury was too high, so the UFC finally banned them, along with head stomps, hair pulling, and small joint manipulation. By the late 1990s, the UFC was still seen as a brutal, lawless spectacle, struggling to gain mainstream acceptance. Fighters like Mark Coleman, Dan Severn, and Pat Miletich played a huge role in legitimizing the sport, but it was UFC 21 that truly changed everything. This event introduced a groundbreaking format. Preliminary fights would have 2 5-minute rounds main. Card fights would have 3, and championship bouts would follow a 5-round structure, pretty much the same system we have today. And then came the biggest shift of all, the 10-point must system. Borrowed from boxing, this scoring method finally gave judges a clear way to determine winners, using criteria like octagon control, striking, grappling, and aggression. Suddenly, MMA wasn't just a free-for-all. It was a structured, strategic sport. But none of that compared to what happened in 2000. That year, UFC 28 became the first event to be officially sanctioned under the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board. Before this, MMA had no standardized rulebook, just a mix of inconsistent and often controversial guidelines. But with the birth of the unified rules of MMA, everything changed. Fighters now had to wear approved gear, undergo medical exams, and follow strict safety protocols. Moves like spiking an opponent on their head, infamously done by Bob Sapp in 2002, were officially outlawed. Yet, even as the sport cleaned up its act, some rules sparked major debate. Perhaps the most infamous? The ban on 12-6 elbow strikes. This rule was put in place after doctors were horrified by the sheer power of straight-down elbow shots, so much so that one doctor outright refused to approve the sport unless they were banned. But the controversy hit an all-time high in 2009 when John Jones, one of the most dominant fighters in UFC history, suffered his only career loss due to disqualification for using 12-6 elbows on Matt Hamill.
Big elbows. No, you can't do 12-6. The commission, people in the commission had seen...
Even today, fighters and fans alike question whether the rules still make sense. And the UFC's evolution didn't stop there. Over the years, bizarre incidents forced the organization to make even more adjustments. In 2009, Georges St-Pierre's cornermen were caught applying Vaseline to his shoulders, chest, and back between rounds, an illegal move that made him nearly impossible to grapple. Dana White's furious reaction led to a permanent rule. Only independent cutmen could apply Vaseline, removing any chance of fighters gaining an unfair advantage. Then there was Dennis Hallman at UFC 133. Instead of wearing normal fight shorts, he stepped into the octagon in a tiny pair of blue trunks so small that Dana White was visibly horrified. Hallman lost, and shortly after, the UFC banned Speedo-style shorts forever.
Was it weird at all for you to compete against someone wearing those?
A little bit, but I've wrestled my whole life, and it is what it is. So, yeah, it didn't throw me off too much. Just him having my back with that big cup that early kind of scared me because I knew he'd have a lot of vigor and a lot of energy.
But perhaps the most groundbreaking change came in 2013, when Ronda Rousey and Liz Carmouche became the first women to ever fight in the UFC. Despite Dana White once famously declaring that women would never compete in the octagon.
When are we going to see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Anytime soon? Never? Never.
The rise of female MMA stars forced the organization to rethink its stance. Fast forward to today, and female fighters like Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko, and Rose Namajunas have become some of the sport's biggest names. And even now, the rules keep evolving. From instant replay reviews introduced in 2020 to new recovery time rules in 2023, MMA continues to refine itself.
Instant replay. Now we've got it in other sports. There's certainly benefits of multiple camera angles, slow motion.
Fighters now have a full 5 minutes to recover from fouls, with doctors required to wait before pressuring them to continue. Officials also crack down on fouls affecting positioning, ensuring that no fighter gains an advantage by committing an illegal move. So, after 30 years of rule changes, controversies, and historic moments, where does MMA go from here? Will the 12-6 elbow rule finally be overturned? Will instant replay reshape how fights are judged? And what unexpected controversy will force the next big evolution of the sport? One thing's for sure, the UFC isn't done changing yet.